the white edging tape that was used to actually strangle Helena Fry with.
The most evil female killers of all time. Smiles, lace, and murder. Evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it smiles, sometimes it wears a dress, and sometimes it rocks a baby to sleep. Tonight, we'll step into the forgotten corners of history, places where the darkness didn't have claws or fangs, but lace and perfume. These are the stories of the most evil female serial killers the world has ever known. From Victorian baby farmers to modern-day motel owners, each woman left behind a trail of innocent lives and horrifying secrets. Amelia Dyer, the Angel Maker. London, 1896, the city of progress, the empire's beating heart, and somewhere between its gaslit streets and narrow alleys, an angel was making her rounds. Her name was Amelia Dyer. To her neighbors, she was a kind middle-aged nurse, a widow trying to make a living, but beneath the polite smile and neat dresses, hid one of the most prolific murderers in British history. She was known as the Angel Maker. And her victims were babies. In Victorian England, being an unwed mother was a curse. Society offered no mercy. If you bore a child out of wedlock, you were shamed, fired, and abandoned. There was only one way out. You could farm your child out to a woman who promised to care for it. These women were called baby farmers. For a small fee, they'd adopt or nurse your baby and make your problem disappear. Amelia Dyer saw an opportunity, a cruel, brilliant business opportunity. She placed newspaper ads. Married couple, respectable, will care for infant, loving home guaranteed. Desperate mothers came to her doorstep, clutching infants wrapped in thin blankets. They handed over their last coins and their last hope. Amelia smiled, reassured them, and closed the door. Those babies would never be seen again. Dyer began her work as a nurse and midwife. She had access to morphine, enough to quiet a crying child. But soon, she discovered something more profitable than medicine. Rather than feed and raise the infants, she let them die quickly. Less cost, more room for new clients. At first, she forged death certificates claiming natural causes. But as the bodies piled up, she needed a new method. She turned to strangulation, using white dressmaker's tape. It was quiet, efficient. She later told police, "That's how you could tell it was mine. There was always tape around the neck." For more than 20 years, babies vanished under her care. She moved from town to town, using false names: Mrs. Harding, Mrs. Smith, Mrs. Thomas. No one suspected her. After all, who would believe a kindly nurse could kill a child? She wrapped the bodies in brown paper, tied them with string, and labeled them with her address, a morbid habit that would one day undo her. Then she carried the tiny bundles to the River Thames. Each splash echoed in the dark, the sound of guilt sinking beneath the current. By 1896, the river had become her graveyard. Fishermen began finding small packages drifting in the water. Inside one, the body of a baby girl, and a piece of paper with the name Mrs. Thomas written on it. That was Amelia Dyer's alias. Police followed the paper trail to her rented house. When they entered, the stench was overwhelming. The sweet, sickly odor of decay. Baby clothes, bottles, letters from desperate mothers, all scattered across the floor. In a locked trunk, they found more horrors: ribbons, baby blankets, and the infamous white tape. Over the following days, they pulled 6 bodies from the Thames. But it was only a fraction of her crimes. Amelia Dyer was arrested and charged with murder. She remained calm, polite, even cooperative. She never cried, never trembled. When asked how many children she had killed, she simply said, "You'll find enough to satisfy you." In prison, Amelia wrote a 12,000-word confession, a chilling document of self-awareness and denial. She claimed she only wanted to help the mothers, that she was not cruel by nature. But in the same breath, she admitted to strangling infants moments after their mothers left. It wasn't rage, it wasn't revenge, it was routine, a cold, methodical system built on misery and secrecy. When her trial began, the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses' handwriting and the discovery of her own name on the paper parcels sealed her fate. The judge asked if she had anything to say before sentencing. She whispered only one word: guilty. On June 10, 1896, Amelia Dyer was hanged at Newgate Prison. She was 59 years old. Outside, the morning rain fell softly over London. The newspapers called her the Ogress of Reading. Others called her the Angel Maker. But some saw her as something else entirely, a reflection of a society that punished poor women, yet allowed monsters like her to thrive in the shadows. When her body dropped, the crowd outside cheered. But in the orphanages and workhouses across England, silence lingered, for there would always be another woman ready to take her place. Amelia Dyer's crimes shocked Victorian Britain. Her case led to stricter child protection laws and the end of baby farming. But even today, no one knows the full count of her victims. Some say 40, others 400. One Scotland Yard inspector wrote, "In all my years, I have never seen a crime so calculated, so cold, and so void of mercy." She didn't kill for lust, or rage, or greed. She killed because the world gave her a system, and she learned how to exploit it. In her care, countless infants took their first and last breath on the same day. And yet, in every newspaper headline, in every sensational story, the horror was hidden behind one word: madwoman. But Amelia Dyer was not mad. She was organized. She was patient. She was a businesswoman in a world that never looked too closely at the poor, the desperate, or the forgotten. They called her the Angel Maker, but no angel ever answered those mothers' prayers. Lavinia Fisher, America's first female serial killer. South Carolina, 1819. A lonely road winds through swamps and pine forest. Travelers come and go, but some never reach their destination. At the edge of Charleston stood a small inn, the 6-mile Wayfarer House. It was a cozy refuge for weary travelers. Candles flickered in the windows. A young woman greeted you at the door, her smile warm, her voice soft. Her name was Lavinia Fisher, and she was about to become a legend. Lavinia and her husband, John Fisher, ran the inn together. They were well-dressed, polite, and, to outsiders, respectable. But behind that charm was a far darker enterprise. The roads around Charleston were plagued with missing persons. Merchants, drifters, farmers, all vanished without a trace. And somehow, all of them were last seen at Lavinia's inn. Guests would arrive at dusk, tired and grateful. Lavinia would offer them supper, often a warm bowl of stew and a cup of tea. She'd listen kindly to their stories, ask where they were headed, whether they carried money. That tea, locals whispered, wasn't just tea, it was laced with poison. According to legend, once her guests fell asleep, or passed out, John Fisher would enter the room through a hidden panel. He'd finish what Lavinia had started. Some accounts claim he stabbed them. Others say he dropped their bodies through a trapdoor beneath the bed, straight into the cellar below. There, the bodies were stripped and buried. By morning, the room was ready for the next traveler. It's hard to say where fact ends and folklore begins, but what's certain is that people began to fear the road to Charleston and the name Fisher. The story might have disappeared into rumor, if not for one man, John Peoples, a traveler who stopped in at the inn one stormy night. Lavinia greeted him with her usual charm and offered tea, but Peoples, feeling uneasy, pretended to drink, and noticed something off in her expression. When he refused to go to bed, she insisted he rest. He lay down, pretending to sleep. That's when he heard a click beneath the bed. Startled, he leapt to his feet, just in time to see the bed collapse into a gaping hole in the floor. He ran into the night, chased by John Fisher, barely escaping with his life. The next morning, he went straight to the authorities. Within days, a posse of armed men surrounded the 6-mile house. What they found inside confirmed the worst fears. Evidence of robbery, stolen goods, a cellar full of bones. Whether every detail was true or embellished, it didn't matter. Charleston had found its villains. Lavinia and John Fisher were arrested and charged with highway robbery, a capital crime at the time. But what haunted the people most wasn't the theft. It was the whispers. The idea that this smiling woman had lured men to their deaths, one cup of tea at a time. The trial became a spectacle. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, demanding justice. Lavinia sat still, composed, dressed in fine clothes, even smiling for onlookers. Her beauty became part of the myth. The devil, they said, hid behind those eyes. Inside the courtroom, the evidence was circumstantial. No formal murder charges could be proven. Only robbery and suspicion of countless deaths. Still, the jury didn't hesitate. Both Lavinia and John were sentenced to hang. In her cell, Lavinia prayed, screamed, and flirted with the guards. depending on the hour. Newspapers painted her as half witch, half seductress. The public was fascinated. A woman killer, in an age when women were supposed to be soft, nurturing, harmless. John Fisher begged the court for forgiveness. He repented, accepted his fate, but Lavinia refused to die quietly. When the day came, the gallows were surrounded by hundreds of spectators. They wanted to see the monster. They wanted to see if she would beg. She didn't. Lavinia Fisher climbed the scaffold in a white dress. The hangman asked if she had any last words. She looked over the crowd, calm, defiant, and said, "If any of you have a message for the devil, tell me now, for I will see him soon." She fell, and with her, the line between history and legend. Was she truly a murderer, or a woman swallowed by rumor, condemned more for her beauty and pride than for her crimes? No one can say for certain. Over the decades, her story became distorted, retold by ghost tours and pulp novels. Some claim she was America's first female serial killer. Others said no bodies were ever found, and that her crimes were exaggerated to frighten travelers. But what's undeniable is her impact. The name Lavinia Fisher still echoes through Charleston's folklore, a symbol of treachery wrapped in charm. Visitors to the Old City Jail say her ghost lingers in the corridors, her white dress gliding through the dark, eyes burning with resentment. Evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it pours a cup of tea. Lavinia Fisher lived in a world that gave her little power. Perhaps she used the only power she had, her beauty, her cunning, and turned it into a weapon. Or perhaps she was the victim of a story written by men who feared a woman who wouldn't bow her head. History doesn't always tell the truth. It tells the version that survives. They say she killed for greed. Others say she never killed at all, but either way, her name will never rest. The 6 Mile House is long gone now. The road to Charleston has changed, but every traveler who drives that stretch of highway at night, if they listen closely through the hum of the engine and the whispering wind, might still hear the faint sound of porcelain clinking, a cup of tea being poured, and a voice saying, softly, "Stay." The night. Belle Gunness, the mistress of Murder Farm. Belle Gunness was not the kind of woman you forgot. Standing over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and cold-eyed, she was a figure that seemed built from iron rather than flesh. She arrived in America from Norway in the late 1800s, chasing the same dream as thousands of others: a new life, a farm, a family. What she built instead was a slaughterhouse. In 1901, Belle settled in LaPorte, Indiana. Her husband died soon after their arrival under suspicious circumstances. The insurance company paid her handsomely. Then another child of hers died. Another insurance claim. Another quiet funeral. People said misfortune followed her, but misfortune didn't follow Belle Gunness. She created it. By 1907, Belle was a widow again, and she began placing advertisements in Lonely Hearts columns. Her letters read sweetly, with perfect grammar and a touch of maternal care. Widow, with farm and fortune, seeks gentlemen for companionship. Must be willing to share in the joys of country life. Dozens of men replied. They were farmers, laborers, lonely men from across the Midwest, each one dreaming of comfort, a home, and a wife to care for them. They arrived in LaPorte carrying cash, because Belle always asked them to bring money for investments or business. None of them were ever seen again. Belle greeted them kindly, cooked them a large meal, and then, when the time was right, struck. Some she poisoned. Others she hit with a meat cleaver or shot in their sleep. Once they were dead, she buried them in the soft earth of her orchard, row after row of nameless graves beneath the apple trees. At first, no one suspected her. She was a widow, a hard-working woman managing a farm alone. The neighbors admired her resilience, her discipline, and her sharp business sense. She even adopted several children, adding to her image of respectability. But behind the curtains, her farmhouse was a place of screams and firelight, where greed and cruelty lived side by side. Her crimes might never have been discovered, if not for one man, Andrew Helgeline. He was a farmer from South Dakota who answered one of Belle's ads. In his letters to his brother, he wrote of how excited he was to meet her, how he planned to marry her and start a new life on her farm. Then the letters stopped. His brother, Asle Helgeline, grew suspicious. He traveled to LaPorte to find him. When he arrived, he found the farmhouse in ashes. It had burned to the ground only days before his arrival. Inside the ruins, police found the bodies of Belle's 3 foster children and a headless woman. At first, they assumed it was Belle herself, that she had perished in the fire, perhaps murdered by an intruder. But Sully didn't believe it. He insisted they dig in the yard. What they uncovered turned Laporte into a national horror story. One by one, the earth gave up its secrets: arms, legs, skulls, decomposed torsos wrapped in burlap sacks. Each hole revealed another victim, another name from Belle's letters. By the time they stopped counting, they had found at least 11 bodies. Some estimates suggested there were more than 40. The people of Laporte called it the murder farm. Newspapers from New York to San Francisco printed her face on the front page. Hell's Belle, they called her, the mistress of Murder Farm. But there was one question no one could answer. Was she dead, or had she escaped? The headless body found in the fire was smaller than Belle's reported size. Neighbors insisted it wasn't her. Others swore they saw a woman matching her description boarding a train days before the blaze. Some claimed she had been seen in Chicago, or even back in Norway, living under a new name. The mystery only deepened as years went by. If Belle faked her death, it was a masterpiece of deception. If she perished, it was the perfect irony. The woman who murdered so many by fire and blade finally consumed by her own flames. What made Belle Gunness so terrifying wasn't just the number of her victims. It was how ordinary her evil seemed. She didn't kill for lust, or rage, or thrill. She killed because it was profitable. She treated murder like a business, efficient, practical, emotionless. To her, men were not people. They were deposits waiting to be collected. When investigators went through her letters, they found hundreds of replies from men who had almost come to her farm but changed their minds at the last minute. Each one had been a potential body in the orchard. Her surviving foster daughter later told police that Belle kept a ledger of her victims. On one page, she listed names, dates, and sums of money. At the bottom, she had written one final note in neat handwriting: total income, $15,000. It wasn't blood that mattered to her, it was balance. The remains of the headless woman were eventually buried under Belle's name, but the legend didn't die with her. For decades, sightings were reported across the Midwest. A woman matching her description, tall and broad, with cold blue eyes, always traveling alone. She was seen buying groceries, renting rooms, disappearing again. Some said she changed her name and lived quietly until old age. Others believed she joined a traveling circus, hiding in plain sight. But no proof ever surfaced, just whispers. In the years that followed, the people of Laporte tried to forget. The orchard was plowed over, the farmhouse rebuilt. But when the wind blows across the old fields, locals still claim they can smell the faint scent of smoke and hear the sound of shovels in the dirt. Belle Gunness remains one of America's most prolific and mysterious killers. Her story challenges every idea of what evil looks like. She was not insane. She was not desperate. She was deliberate. A predator who understood how to manipulate trust, love, and loneliness, and use them as tools for profit. In a world that believed women were incapable of violence, Belle Gunness proved them wrong in the worst possible way. She used society's blind spot as her weapon. No one suspected her because no one could imagine a woman committing such horrors. And perhaps that's the most disturbing truth of all, that the monster hiding behind the farmhouse window wasn't a creature of nightmares, but a woman who smiled, wrote letters in careful cursive, and baked bread while her victims decomposed beneath the apple trees. They say evil always leaves a trace. In Belle Gunness's case, it left dozens of them, buried in the soil beneath the roots of her orchard. And if she truly escaped that night, walking away from the flames she created, then, somewhere in the dark, she smiled, knowing the world would never stop wondering if she was still out there. Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess. In the late 1500s, deep within the mountains of Hungary, stood a castle shrouded in fog and legend. Its owner was Countess Elizabeth Báthory, a woman of wealth, intellect, and beauty. She spoke several languages, managed vast estates, and was connected to the royal court. To her servants and subjects, she was nobility incarnate, graceful, commanding, untouchable. But behind the stone walls of Château Castle, something monstrous was taking shape. History would remember her by another name, the Blood Countess. Born into one of the most powerful families in Europe, Elizabeth was raised amid privilege and cruelty. From an early age, she witnessed acts of violence that would scar any child. Executions were public spectacles, and discipline was delivered through pain. It was said she learned early that fear was the fastest path to obedience. At 15, she married Count Ferenc Nadasti, a celebrated soldier known as the Black Hero of Hungary. While he fought in wars against the Ottoman Empire, Elizabeth ruled his lands in his absence. She oversaw hundreds of servants and peasants, controlled finances, and enforced justice. But power, left unchecked, began to twist. What began as strict discipline soon became torture. Servants whispered of strange punishments, girls beaten for dropping a stitch, starved for minor mistakes, or left outside to freeze. No one dared question her. She was a Bathory. Her name was the law. After her husband's death in 1604, the cruelty escalated. Elizabeth became restless, withdrawn, consumed by obsessions with youth and beauty. She surrounded herself with a small circle of loyal attendants, women who shared her taste for suffering. Together, they lured young peasant girls to the castle with promises of work, education, or service. The girls entered the gates of Chete and never left. The stories that emerged later were almost impossible to believe. Witnesses claimed that Elizabeth beat her victims with iron rods, stabbed them with needles, or burned them with candles. Some said she bit their flesh, tearing at their skin until blood ran freely. Others swore she bathed in that blood, believing it would preserve her beauty forever. It's hard to separate myth from fact. The tales of bloodbaths may have been born from gossip, twisted by time and fear, but even without them, the reality remains horrifying. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of girls vanished under her care. For years, no one dared accuse her openly. She was a countess, and her victims were poor. In that world, the word of a servant meant nothing. But when the daughters of lesser nobles began to disappear, whispers turned into outrage. In 1610, King Matthias ordered an investigation. A nobleman named György Thurzo was sent to the castle. What he found changed history. He entered the fortress unannounced. In the great hall, he found a girl's body lying on the floor, lifeless and bruised. Another girl was dying nearby, her skin marked by burns and wounds. In the dungeons, more bodies, some dead, some barely breathing. The stench of blood and decay hung in the air. Thurzo arrested Elizabeth and her servants on the spot. Her attendants confessed quickly, describing years of torture under her orders. They claimed she kept a book, a ledger listing every victim, more than 600 names written in her own hand. The book was never found, but the legend endured. Elizabeth's rank protected her from execution. The court could not publicly hang a countess without shaking the very foundations of nobility. So, they devised another punishment. In 1611, Elizabeth Bathory was confined to a single room within her own castle. The windows were bricked up. The door had only a small slit through which guards passed food. There she lived, isolated in darkness, for 4 years. No one saw her again. On August 21st, 1614, a guard peered through the slit and found her motionless on the floor. She was 54 years old. The castle was silent. No one mourned her. The peasants rejoiced, saying the land itself felt lighter. Over the centuries, her name became legend. Writers called her the inspiration for vampires, for Countess Dracula, for every tale where beauty hides bloodlust. But historians still debate how much of it was true. Some claim the stories were exaggerated, propaganda from men who envied her wealth and independence. Others insist the evidence was undeniable, that she was every bit the monster the world believed her to be. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, a powerful woman consumed by paranoia, cruelty, and vanity, and a society eager to see her fall. Elizabeth Bathory remains a mirror for human darkness. She was born into privilege, educated, refined, and yet capable of unimaginable brutality. She represents the corruption of power when empathy dies, and the danger of believing oneself untouchable. Even now, her castle still stands, a ruin overlooking the Slovak hills. Tourists walk its halls and swear they can feel something watching. Some say the air grows colder near the chamber where she was sealed. Others say her story is not haunting because of ghosts, but because it reminds us of what power, left unchecked, can do. They called her the Blood Countess because she ruled through fear and cruelty. But perhaps her truest legacy is the silence of those who served her, the hundreds who saw and said nothing. History loves to turn monsters into myths, but behind every myth is a choice. The choice to look away or to confront what we've created. Elizabeth Bathory never faced a public trial, never spoke her final words, never showed remorse. Her crimes were sealed inside her castle walls, like her body after death. And yet, more than 400 years later, her name still bleeds through time. A noblewoman who believed beauty was worth any price, a killer who thought herself untouchable, a legend born from the screams of the powerless. Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess, a woman who tried to conquer death, and instead became eternal through it. Jeanne Toppan, the Angel of Death. Her name was Jeanne Toppan, but in the wards of Massachusetts General Hospital, the nurses called her Jolly Jane. She was friendly, always smiling, always eager to help. Patients trusted her, doctors praised her. She had a reputation for kindness and a touch that could calm anyone's fear. But that same gentle hand was laced with poison, because Jeanne Toppan's idea of comfort was death. She was born Honora Kelly in 1854 to an Irish immigrant family that had already begun to crumble. Her mother died of tuberculosis when Jeanne was still a child. Her father, an alcoholic tailor, eventually lost his mind. He was rumored to have sewn his own eyelids shut before being taken to an asylum. Jeanne was sent away to an orphanage, forgotten like so many poor children of her time. There, she learned a painful lesson, that affection could be earned through performance, that a smile could be armor, that pretending to care was safer than being honest. Years later, she was taken in as an indentured servant by the Toppan family of Lowell, Massachusetts. They gave her a new name, a new life, and a lifelong resentment toward those who had everything she never would. When she finally trained as a nurse, her superiors saw potential. She was quick, intelligent, and obedient. But beneath the calm exterior, something had begun to twist. At the hospital, Jeanne had access to the one thing that fascinated her most: drugs, morphine and atropine, two sides of the same coin. One slowed the heart, the other sped it up. Together, in precise doses, they could bring a person to the edge of death, and then back again. Jeanne began to experiment. She administered small doses to her patients to observe the effects. Then she adjusted, just enough to make them drift in and out of consciousness. She told herself she was learning, helping, perfecting her craft, but it didn't take long before curiosity turned to desire. She discovered that in those moments, when a patient's life flickered like a candle, she felt something she had never felt before: power. She later told investigators that watching a person die gave her intense pleasure. It thrilled her to hold their life in her hands, to decide when they would take their final breath. Soon, she no longer waited for the sick. She made them sick. At first, her victims were the elderly and terminally ill. Then, they were people she simply disliked: a patient who complained too much, a colleague who spoke ill of her. She mixed poisons into their medicine, smiled as she gave it to them, and stayed by their bedside to witness the results. Sometimes she would climb into bed beside them as they slipped away, whispering softly as their pulse faded. She said it made her feel close to them, as if she could absorb their final moment. By the time she left the hospital, dozens of patients had died under her care. But in an era before modern forensics, no one questioned it. Doctors assumed it was bad luck. Jeanne was praised for her dedication to the dying. When she began working as a private nurse, her murders became even bolder. She moved into the homes of wealthy families, caring for the sick and elderly, and slowly killing them one by one. She poisoned a landlord, then moved in with his wife and poisoned her too. She killed a friend just to attend the funeral and comfort the grieving family. But her most infamous act came when she turned on her own employers, the Davis family of Calumet, Massachusetts. Within weeks of her arrival, 3 members of the household were dead. Each had suffered convulsions, vomiting, and paralysis, classic symptoms of atropine poisoning. Still, Jeanne played the role of the morning nurse perfectly. She wept, prayed, and even suggested possible causes to the doctors. But when she poisoned her final victim, the daughter of the family, who had trusted her completely, suspicion finally caught up with her. An autopsy revealed traces of morphine. The police arrested her in 1901. At first, Jeanne denied everything. Then, during questioning, something broke. She began to talk, calmly, proudly, as if describing her work. She confessed to killing 31 people, though investigators suspected the number was far higher. When asked why, she smiled and said, "I had a good time." She admitted to poisoning her foster sister, to lying in bed beside the dying, to feeling a sense of excitement as their breathing slowed. She described one victim as so sweet and trusting, it was almost like killing a child. Her confession chilled even the most hardened detectives. One wrote, "She is not mad in the ordinary sense. She is a perversion of the soul itself." In court, doctors debated whether she was insane. Jane herself told them she wasn't, that she knew right from wrong, but simply preferred the thrill of killing. She said she wanted to kill more people than any man or woman who ever lived. The jury found her not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed to the Taunton State Lunatic Hospital, where she lived for the rest of her life. There, she continued her strange rituals, pretending to nurse other patients, manipulating the staff, and boasting about her crimes. She lived for decades behind those walls, aging into obscurity. When she died in 1938, few remembered her name, but the legend of Jolly Jane, the nurse who found pleasure in death, survived. Her story forces a question that lingers long after the facts have faded. How could someone so close to suffering take joy in causing it? Was Jane Toppan born without empathy? Or did a lifetime of rejection twist her into something else entirely? Perhaps the answer lies in her own words. "I was born with the devil in me," she once said, echoing another killer's sentiment decades before it was spoken. It was natural as breathing to want to see people die. Her crimes exposed the vulnerability of trust, the blind faith we place in those who promise to care for us. And perhaps that is why her story remains so disturbing, because we all must, at some point, trust someone like her, a doctor, a nurse, a caretaker. We must believe they want us to live. Jane Toppan proved how fragile that faith can be. She wore kindness like a costume, compassion like a mask. Behind it was only curiosity, cold, scientific-y, and cruel. When she looked into the faces of her victims, she didn't see pain, she saw opportunity. A chance to feel alive by watching someone else die. And in the quiet halls of the hospital where she once worked, people still say her presence lingers, not as a ghost, but as a warning, that sometimes the angel at your bedside is the one who brings you closer to death. Velma Barfield, the preacher's poisoner. Her story begins like so many others, with a church, a small town, and a woman who seemed incapable of harm. Velma Barfield was a grandmother, a devout Christian, and a kind neighbor. She sang hymns, baked pies for the congregation, and cared for the sick. She was the last person anyone would suspect of murder, but beneath that gentle face was a secret that would shock the entire state of North Carolina. Velma was born in 1932 in a rural family haunted by poverty and violence. Her father drank heavily and beat her mother. From a young age, Velma learned to survive by appearing small, obedient, and harmless. She married at 17, eager to escape the chaos of home. Her husband, Thomas Burke, was a construction worker, loving at first, then drunk, then cruel. By her 30s, Velma was trapped in a cycle of abuse, depression, and painkillers. The pills numbed her body, but they also numbed her fear. And over time, that numbness became something darker. When Thomas died suddenly in 1969, supposedly from heart failure, no one asked questions. Velma mourned publicly, dressed in black, and leaned on her faith. She told everyone that God had taken him for a reason. But behind closed doors, she had already found the season that would define her life: arsenic. After her husband's death, Velma married again. Her second husband, Jennings Barfield, was kind but frail, suffering from health problems. Within a year, he too was dead, another mystery illness. Doctors assumed it was complications from diabetes. Velma collected the insurance money and returned to church. Those who knew her described her as generous and deeply religious. She read scripture daily, volunteered at nursing homes, and prayed with the sick. But even in prayer, she carried her bottle of poison. She began caring for elderly relatives, including her own mother. When her mother fell ill in 1974, Velma was at her bedside day and night. She cried as her mother slipped away, and then calmly arranged the funeral. No one doubted her devotion. Later, she moved in with an elderly couple, Montgomery and Dolly Edwards, to work as a caregiver. Within months, both were dead. Velma's explanation was always the same. God just needed another angel, but God had nothing to do with it. The deaths began to form a pattern. All those close to Velma, all suddenly gone, all leaving behind insurance payouts or small inheritances. Still, In a community built on trust and faith, suspicion came slowly. It wasn't until 1978 that Velma's mask finally began to crack. That year, she started dating a man named Roland Stewart Taylor, a widower who attended her church. He was quiet, kind, and deeply religious, just like her. But their relationship soured when Velma began stealing checks from his account to fund her addiction to prescription drugs. When he confronted her, she panicked. Rather than confess, she reached for the one thing that had always silenced her problems. She prepared him a bowl of soup and added arsenic. Within days, he was dead. This time, the doctors noticed something strange. His organs showed signs of poisoning. The police ordered an autopsy, and the truth began to surface. Arsenic, the same poison that had killed so many others. Velma Barfield was arrested. At first, she denied everything. Then, faced with the evidence, she broke down. In tears, she confessed to poisoning not only Stewart Taylor, but her own mother and several others. She said she had been out of her mind, desperate, addicted, unable to stop herself. Her voice trembled as she said, "I never meant to hurt anyone." But the facts told another story. The careful preparation, the repeated pattern, the calmness with which she watched her victims die. Velma knew exactly what she was doing. During her trial, her defense argued that she was mentally ill, that her years of trauma and addiction had destroyed her judgment. The prosecution painted her as a cold, manipulative killer who used faith as a disguise. When the jury delivered its verdict, guilty of first-degree murder, Velma bowed her head and whispered a prayer. She was sentenced to death. On death row, Velma Barfield became something unexpected, a symbol of repentance. She began writing letters to families of her victims, begging for forgiveness. She led Bible studies with other inmates, counseled women struggling with addiction, and spoke openly about guilt and grace. Many who met her described her as transformed, peaceful, remorseful, redeemed. She told reporters, "I know I deserve to die, but I also know God has forgiven me." Her story divided America. To some, she was a murderer hiding behind religion. To others, she was proof that redemption was possible, even at the edge of death. Appeals delayed her execution for several years, but on November 2nd, 1984, Velma Barfield was led to the gas chamber at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina. She was 52 years old, the first woman executed in the United States after the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. Her final words were a prayer for everyone she had hurt. Then she looked at the prison chaplain and said softly, "When I go, don't cry for me. I'll be home." In the years since her death, people have argued over what Velma Barfield really was. A calculating killer, a broken soul seeking redemption, or a woman who hid behind faith until faith became her only refuge. Her crimes remain horrifying, not because of their brutality, but because of their quietness. There were no weapons, no blood, no screams, only trust, and a spoonful of poison. Velma's victims were people who loved her, a husband, a mother, friends, and a man who thought he'd found companionship in his final years. She took them all, one by one, with calm precision and gentle hands. And that is what makes her story so chilling. Evil didn't storm through the door that day. It smiled, bowed its head, and said, "Grace." Velma Barfield's legacy is a contradiction. She was both murderer and minister, sinner and believer, destroyer and comforter. She spent her final years warning others not to follow her path, pleading with addicts and caretakers to seek help before it was too late. But for those who lost loved ones, her repentance could never undo what she had done. Perhaps the most haunting truth is that Velma herself understood this. In her final letter, written hours before her death, she wrote, "I am not afraid to die. I only hope that in my death, someone else might choose to live." She called herself forgiven. The world called her a killer. Both were right. Velma Barfield, the grandmother who poisoned for comfort, the preacher's friend who prayed for mercy, and the woman whose last breath was a confession whispered to God. Dagmar Overby, the Copenhagen baby killer. In early 20th century Denmark, few people inspired more trust than Dagmar Overby. She was a quiet woman in her 40s, with neat hair, modest clothes, and a gentle motherly voice. She lived in Copenhagen, where she offered a service that seemed like an act of kindness. She took care of unwanted babies. In an age when poverty and shame could destroy a woman's life, Dagmar promised a solution. She would take in infants born out of wedlock, nurse them, and find them homes with respectable families. For desperate mothers, she seemed like an angel of mercy. But behind her polite manner and tidy apartment was a truth too terrible to imagine. Dagmar Overby was not an angel. She was one of the most prolific child murderers in European history. She was born in 1887 in a small village outside Aarhus. Her childhood was poor and lonely. Her mother was strict, her father absent. Neighbors later said that Dagmar was always quiet, a child who preferred dolls to people, and who often sat alone for hours, humming softly to herself. When she grew older, she worked as a servant and laundress. She lived on the edge of survival, moving from job to job. Then, in her 30s, she began taking in children, sometimes for payment, sometimes as an act of charity. In those days, Denmark had no real system for adoption or child care. Mothers who couldn't raise their babies had few options. They could give the child to relatives, leave it at an orphanage, or, increasingly, pay women like Dagmar to care for it in secret. To many, she seemed ideal, discreet, kind, and dependable. She promised to find each child a new home, often telling the mothers she had good families waiting. But no such families existed. When police finally discovered what she had done, the truth horrified even hardened detectives. For years, Dagmar had been killing the babies left in her care, one after another, without remorse. She strangled some with her bare hands, drowned others in buckets or basins, and sometimes burned their tiny bodies in her stove. To her, it was routine, an efficient solution to what she saw as a business problem. It's believed she murdered at least 9 infants, though some investigators estimated as many as 25. When asked why, she offered a simple explanation. It was too much trouble to find them homes. She killed not in anger or hatred, but out of convenience. Her victims were nameless, voiceless, and easily forgotten, except by the mothers who had trusted her. The case came to light by accident in 1920. A young mother reported her baby missing after leaving it with Dagmar. Police searched her apartment on Enghaveve, a modest flat filled with baby clothes, bottles, and toys. At first, it looked ordinary, but when they opened the stove, they found ashes that were not wood or coal, and the faint outline of tiny bones. Further searches revealed small bundles of clothing hidden behind furniture, a bucket filled with cloudy water, and letters from dozens of mothers asking for updates about their children. Dagmar had never responded to any of them. She was arrested on the spot. During interrogation, she confessed calmly, as if describing housework. "I took care of them," she said. "When the crying wouldn't stop, I made it stop." At her trial in 1921, the courtroom was packed. The press called her the Copenhagen baby killer. Some reporters described her as cold and calculating. Others said she looked detached, as if she barely understood the gravity of her crimes. When the prosecutor read the list of victims, Dagmar sat motionless. Only once did she show emotion, when her own child was mentioned. She had once had a baby of her own, who had died years earlier under suspicious circumstances. Neighbors whispered that perhaps that had been her first victim. Her defense argued that she was insane. Doctors examined her and described her as morally defective, but fully aware of her actions. She planned the killings carefully, often timing them around the mother's visits, disposing of the evidence before anyone could notice. One witness recalled how she burned the bodies late at night, humming lullabies while the smoke drifted into the cold Copenhagen air. It was that image, the woman rocking in her chair by the stove, singing to herself as the fire consumed the innocent, that haunted Denmark for decades. When the verdict came, Dagmar Overby was found guilty of 9 murders. She was sentenced to death, the first woman in modern Danish history to receive that punishment. But Denmark's king, Christian VI, commuted her sentence to life imprisonment, citing her mental instability. She spent the rest of her life behind bars, quiet and obedient, rarely speaking to anyone. Guards described her as polite, tidy, and utterly emotionless. She never expressed regret. When asked if she ever thought of the mothers who trusted her, she simply said, "They were happy to be rid of the trouble." She died in prison in 1929 at the age of 42. Dagmar Overby's case sent shockwaves through Denmark. It exposed the dark reality of poverty, shame, and neglect that had driven desperate women into the hands of predators. It forced the government to reform adoption laws and create systems to protect children from private baby farmers. In that sense, her evil reshaped the country, but the human cost could never be measured. No one could identify all the babies she killed. There were no graves, no names, no memorials, just ashes and silence. For years afterward, mothers would warn their daughters, "Don't trust strangers with your child." Everyone knew who they meant. What makes Dagmar Overby's story so haunting isn't just the horror of her actions, but their banality. She wasn't driven by rage or jealousy or money. She didn't kill for revenge or passion. She killed because it was easier than caring. That absence of emotion, the hollow calmness with which she took life after life, is what chills the soul. There was no madness in her eyes, no fire of hatred, only indifference. And sometimes, indifference is the purest form of evil. Today, her name is rarely spoken in Denmark, and her old apartment building no longer stands. But her shadow lingers in every story of lost children, every whisper about trust betrayed. Because Dagmar Overby's crimes remind us of something uncomfortable, that monstrosity can hide behind gentleness, that cruelty can wear the face of care. She promised comfort to mothers in despair. She offered peace, safety, and a future, and then she took everything. Dagmar Overby, the woman who turned kindness into death, and whose crimes forced a nation to look at the darkness it had ignored for too long. Nannie Doss, the giggling granny. Her laughter was the first thing people noticed about her, a soft, grandmotherly giggle that never seemed to end. She smiled at everyone, at neighbors, at police officers, even in court. That smile earned her a nickname that would haunt America for decades, the giggling granny. Her real name was Nancy Hazel Doss, born in 1905 in Blue Mountain, Alabama. She grew up poor, isolated, and under the strict rule of a violent father. He forbade her from wearing makeup, from having friends, from ever going out alone. Her only escape was in the pages of romance magazines, stories filled with handsome men, happy marriages, and love that lasted forever. Those stories shaped her dreams, but when she went looking for love herself, she found something very different. Nannie married for the first time when she was 16. Her husband, Charlie Braggs, worked at a railway company. At first, she thought he was her ticket to freedom, but within weeks, the marriage turned bitter. Charlie was jealous, cold, and unfaithful. He drank heavily and often disappeared for days. Nannie stayed home with their 4 daughters, lonely, frustrated, and increasingly resentful. When 2 of the children died suddenly under mysterious circumstances, Charlie grew terrified. He fled, taking their oldest daughter with him, leaving the others behind. Nannie blamed him for everything and moved on. Her next marriages followed a deadly pattern. Each man seemed charming at first, each disappointed her, and each ended up dead. In the 1940s and 50s, Lonely Hearts columns were the social media of their day. Newspaper ads where single men and women could search for love. Nannie loved those ads. She wrote dozens of letters, signing them, "Yours truly, Mrs. Nannie Doss," describing herself as a cheerful widow who loved cooking, gardening, and God. Behind the words, though, was a woman looking not for companionship, but for control. Her second husband, Frank Harrelson, seemed like a match made in heaven. He sent her romantic letters and sweet gifts. They married, quickly, but on their wedding night, she discovered the truth. Frank was an alcoholic with a violent temper. When he came home drunk one night, raging and cruel, Nannie decided she'd had enough. The next morning, she mixed arsenic into his corn whiskey. By evening, Frank was dead. When the police asked if she suspected foul play, she smiled and said, "Oh no, poor Frank drank himself to death." They believed her. Everyone did. After Frank's death, Nannie married again. This time to Arlie Lanning, a man she met through another Lonely Hearts ad. He died suddenly too. Doctors said heart failure. Nannie collected the life insurance money and moved in with her sister Dovie. When Dovie fell mysteriously ill and died soon after, Nannie didn't even wait for the funeral before leaving town. Her next husband, Richard Morton, also met the same fate. By now she had refined her method. A few doses of rat poison, hidden in coffee or pie, administered with patience and a smile. She poisoned slowly, enough to make her victims sick, weak, and dependent on her. Then, when she was ready, she gave the final dose. But Nannie didn't stop at husbands. She poisoned her own mother, claiming she was helping her pass peacefully. She killed her grandson after he annoyed her. Her victims were family, friends, lovers, anyone who stood between her and the life she imagined she deserved. In 1954, Nannie married for the last time. Her fifth husband, Samuel Doss, was a strict, deeply religious man from Oklahoma. He disliked Nannie's romance magazines and forbade her from reading them. He wanted a quiet, modest wife, and Nannie wanted excitement. When Samuel fell ill shortly after their wedding, doctors found his symptoms strange: severe stomach pain, vomiting, exhaustion. He recovered for a few days until Nannie brought him a slice of her homemade prune cake. Within hours, he was dead. But this time, the doctors were suspicious. They ordered an autopsy, and what they found shocked them: massive amounts of arsenic in his system. Police exhumed his body and immediately arrested Nannie Doss. When they confronted her, she giggled. Even as detectives read the list of her victims, she laughed, and when asked why she had done it, she said, still smiling, "I was just tired of them." Her confession stunned the nation. She spoke openly, almost proudly, about poisoning 11 people, 4 husbands, 2 children, her mother, her sister, and several other relatives. She claimed she'd done it out of frustration, boredom, and loneliness. Not for money, not for revenge, simply because, in her words, they got on my nerves. She seemed to enjoy the attention, joking with reporters and laughing during her trial. Her cheerful attitude made her even more terrifying. One journalist wrote, "She smiled as she spoke of death, the kind of smile you never forget." When the judge sentenced her to life imprisonment, Nannie didn't cry. She said she was glad it was over. She spent the rest of her life in the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, tending the prison garden and chatting with guards who said she was polite and kind, if you didn't think too hard about who she was. Nannie Doss died in 1965 of leukemia at the age of 60. Her death made only a small headline: "Giggling Granny passes away." But her legacy lived on, a warning wrapped in a smile. What made her so disturbing wasn't just the number of her victims. It was how ordinary she seemed. No one ever saw anger in her. She killed with calmness, patience, and a sense of humor. To her, death was a solution, not a sin. Psychologists later described her as a narcissist who confused love with control, a woman whose fantasy of romance was so powerful that reality could never satisfy it. Every disappointment, every argument, every moment of boredom ended in poison. Perhaps she saw herself as a character from the love stories she adored, a woman taking charge of her own destiny, cleansing her life of unhappiness. Or perhaps she was simply bored with the world and found in murder a kind of entertainment. Whatever her motives, one thing is certain: Nannie Doss never stopped smiling. Even when she spoke of her crimes, her laughter filled the room, soft, musical, and deeply wrong. In the end, Nannie Doss was both predator and parody, a grandmother who baked cookies, tended roses, and quietly destroyed everyone who loved her. Her story exposes the thin line between affection and control, between comfort and cruelty. She proved that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes, it looks like a sweet old lady offering you a slice of pie. And as long as people crave love so desperately that they stop seeing what's real, there will always be someone like Nannie Doss, smiling, patient, and waiting for the next lonely heart to answer her call. Bertha Gifford, the quiet killer. In the small farming towns of Missouri, everyone knew Bertha Gifford. She was the kind of woman people trusted without question, the neighbor who brought soup when you were sick, who stayed up all night to care for the dying, who spoke softly and prayed often. To her community, she was a saint. To history, she became something far darker. Between 1903 and 1918, at least 17 people died under her care: neighbors, friends, and family. Their deaths were quiet, unremarkable, and often followed by praise for Bertha's devotion. But every time she wiped a fevered brow, every time she offered medicine from her kitchen, she was administering something else entirely: arsenic. She was known as the quiet killer. And like all quiet things, her evil took time to be heard. Bertha was born in 1871 on a farm near Catawissa, Missouri. Her childhood was simple, even dull, the kind that leaves no mark on history. She married young, at 17, to a Worcester local man named Henry Graham. Neighbors said she was a good wife, though often withdrawn, with a habit of staring out windows for long stretches, as if she were somewhere else entirely. When her husband died suddenly of gastric troubles, no one questioned it. Death was common in rural America, and illness often came without warning. Within a year, Bertha married again, this time to James Gifford, a mechanic and carpenter. They settled on a small farm near Catawissa, where Bertha's reputation as a healer began to grow. People said Bertha had the touch. When children got sick, she came running with warm broth and a basket of herbs. When fevers spread, she sat by the bedside, whispering prayers and dabbing cool water on burning foreheads. Families trusted her more than doctors. She was kind, patient, and always nearby. But as the years went by, a strange pattern emerged. People tended to die when Bertha helped them. Her husband's relatives fell ill one after another. Children who visited her farm for pie and milk grew sick soon after. A young boy she cared for during a bout of diphtheria died suddenly. And when neighbors offered condolences, Bertha only shrugged and said, "The Lord takes who he chooses." She spoke of death the way other women spoke of weather, calm, inevitable, and beyond control. By 1910, Bertha had found her perfect disguise: compassion. She volunteered to nurse the sick during influenza outbreaks, especially in isolated farms where doctors took days to arrive. She carried her own medicine, a white powder she said would settle the stomach. She mixed it into food, tea, and soup, sometimes spoon-feeding her patients while humming softly. The powder was arsenic. In small doses, it caused nausea and weakness. In larger doses, paralysis and death. Bertha used it carefully, stretching her victims' suffering over days, ensuring their symptoms looked natural. Her motives were unclear. Some believed she killed for mercy, to end pain. Others thought she enjoyed the attention, the gratitude, the image of the selfless caregiver. Her surviving relatives later said she seemed happiest when someone was dying in her arms. As more deaths followed, whispers began to spread. But Bertha's calm nature disarmed suspicion. She attended every funeral, comforting the families and cooking for the mourners. Her presence was so reassuring that even those who wondered about her couldn't bring themselves to believe the truth. She couldn't hurt a fly, one neighbor said. And maybe that was true. She never had to. Flies were beneath her notice. The dead were quiet. The living trusted her. And so the pattern continued. It wasn't until 1928, 25 years after her first suspected killing, that anyone dared to question her. A relative noticed that nearly everyone who had fallen ill under Bertha's care had died, while she herself remained untouched by every epidemic. When her stepdaughter's husband, Ed Brinley, died suddenly after Bertha's visit, his family demanded an autopsy. The results were unmistakable: arsenic poisoning. Police exhumed several other bodies linked to her. Each showed the same signs. Every stomach contained traces of arsenic, enough to kill within hours. Bertha was arrested. When questioned, she appeared calm and polite, insisting she had only tried to ease suffering. "I never meant to harm anyone," she said softly. "I just couldn't stand to see them in pain." Her trial took place in Union, Missouri in 1929. The courtroom was packed with journalists, neighbors, and curious strangers. They came expecting to see a monster. Instead, they saw a small, middle-aged woman with soft eyes and neatly braided hair. The prosecution painted her as a cold-blooded murderer who had hidden behind compassion. The defense argued she was insane, a woman driven mad by a need to help others, no matter the cost. Doctors testified that she seemed detached from reality, unable to distinguish between mercy and murder. When asked why she gave arsenic to people who were not dying, Bertha looked puzzled. "They were suffering," she said. "I wanted to help." After weeks of testimony, the jury declared her not guilty by reason of insanity. She was sent to the Missouri State Hospital, where she would remain for the rest of her life. In the hospital, Bertha lived quietly, helping nurses care for other patients. Staff described her as kind and cooperative, a woman who seemed genuinely gentle. She never spoke of her crimes. She never expressed guilt. To her, she had done nothing wrong. Perhaps in her mind, she really had been helping. She died in 1951, at the age of 80. By then, most people had forgotten her name. Her story faded into small-town legend, the kind people whisper about on porches and in church basements. But for those who knew the truth, she was a reminder that even kindness can kill. Bertha Gifford's story doesn't fit the usual mold of evil. She wasn't angry, jealous, or greedy. She didn't act out of hate. She acted out of a kind of twisted mercy, the belief that she could decide who deserved to live and who should be spared further pain. In her mind, she was both nurse and savior. In reality, she was judge and executioner. Her victims came to her seeking comfort. They found it, for a while, in her calm voice, her steady hands, her soft prayers. And then they died, quietly, believing they were being cared for. That is the most terrifying part of her legacy, the ease with which love and death coexisted in her hands. No one suspected the woman who smiled and said grace before every meal. No one thought to question the healer, but as the years passed and her victims were counted, a grim truth emerged. That kindness without conscience is just another mask for cruelty. Bertha Gifford, the nurse who never wore a uniform, the woman who believed mercy could come from a spoonful of poison, and the quiet killer whose silence still echoes through Missouri's fields. Jeanne, the ogress of Paris, Provence, at the dawn of the 20th century, a city of art, light, and life. But behind the elegant cafes and crowded boulevards, poverty and sickness festered in the working-class neighborhoods. It was in one of those narrow, gray streets that a woman named Jeanne offered her help. She was 30, poor, and motherly. Her clothes were plain, her voice gentle. She loved children, everyone said, always willing to babysit, always eager to lend a hand to struggling mothers. When a neighbor had to work long hours at the laundry or the factory, Jeanne would step in, smiling. "Don't worry," she would say, "I'll take care of the little one." And she did. But the children she cared for rarely lived long. In 1905, Jeanne's own 2 children had died suddenly. Doctors called it convulsions, a common diagnosis for poor families whose infants wasted away in overcrowded apartments. Jeanne was heartbroken, or so she seemed. She began spending her time with other people's children, desperate to fill the void. One day, her sister asked her to watch her baby for a few hours. When Jeanne returned the infant, the child was pale and still. Doctors said it was sudden infant death. Jeanne cried and hugged her sister, whispering prayers through her tears. The family never suspected a thing. But weeks later, another child in the family died the same way. And then another. Each time, Jeanne was there. Each time, she offered comfort, not answers. It wasn't just family. Neighbors began to notice that babies fell ill after spending time with her. Some described finding faint bruises around the children's necks, or the marks of tiny fingernails pressed into their skin. But who would accuse a grieving mother of such things? Who could imagine that a woman so gentle could do harm to a child? Still, the deaths continued. In 1906, Jeanne was finally caught in the act. A neighbor entered her apartment unannounced and found her leaning over a baby, hands around its throat. The child was blue and gasping, but alive. Jeanne was arrested. When questioned, she denied everything, insisting she had been trying to help. The courts charged her with murder, but there was no physical evidence strong enough to prove it. The doctors could not agree on the cause of death, and the jury, swayed by her calm demeanor and maternal appearance, acquitted her. She walked free. After her release, Jeanne left Paris and moved from town to town, taking jobs as a nanny and maid. Everywhere she went, tragedy followed. In 1907, she found work caring for children in the village of Orgeville. Within weeks, 2 of them were dead. When neighbors confronted her, she wept hysterically and blamed the will of God. Once again, no one dared accuse her directly. She returned to Paris, changing her name to mask her past. For a while, she disappeared from the public eye, until one final crime brought her face back to the newspapers. In 1908, Jeanne was living with a man named Ruse, a widower with 2 young children. She doted on them, cooking meals, helping with homework, singing them lullabies at night. But soon, one of the children fell ill. The doctors found nothing unusual, then the younger one began to choke, seemingly without reason. When Ruse walked into the room, he found Jeanne crouched beside the child's bed, her hands pressed around the boy's neck. He screamed, and Jeanne fled into the streets. She was arrested hours later, her dress torn, her hair wild. This time, the authorities didn't hesitate. She confessed, not calmly, but in a strange mix of pride and despair. "They suffered too much," she said. "I set them free." The newspapers called her l'ogresse de Paris, the ogress of Paris. To the public, she was no longer a woman, but a monster. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse shouting for her execution. Inside, she sat quietly, smiling faintly as the charges were read. Doctors declared her insane, suffering from what they described as hysteria and moral perversion. They said she found pleasure in the act of strangulation, a pathological need for control. Her defense argued she had lost her mind after the deaths of her own children. The court found her not guilty by reason of insanity and sent her to an asylum in Maraville. There, witnesses said, she behaved like a child, singing, laughing, and asking to hold the infants of visiting nurses. The nurses refused. Jeanne Weber remained in the asylum for 7 years. Then, one morning in 1918, attendants found her dead in her cell. She had hanged herself with a strip of her bedsheet. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave outside the hospital grounds. No one claimed her. Her death barely made the papers, overshadowed by the end of the First World War. But in the poorer neighborhoods of Paris, mothers still whispered her name when they put their children to bed. Sleep well, or the ogress will come for you. Modern criminologists have debated Jeanne Weber's case for decades. Was she a sadist who took pleasure in suffering? A woman broken by grief, reliving the deaths of her own children again and again? Or something even more complex, Gifford, a mind so warped that she confused death with love? Her crimes fit what doctors now call Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a condition where caregivers cause harm to those they claim to protect, in order to gain sympathy or attention. But Jeanne Weber went further. She didn't want pity, she wanted power, the power to give life and take it away. In her own way, she was trying to erase her pain by recreating it, to relive the moment of loss on her own terms. Each death was a twisted echo of her own heartbreak. Jeanne Weber's story reveals one of the most terrifying truths about evil, that it can come disguised as care. She didn't hide in shadows or alleys. She hid in plain sight, in the role society trusted most, the caregiver, the mother, the protector. Her victims were the most innocent of all, children who reached out for affection and found death instead. And even now, more than a century later, her case remains a stain on the idea that goodness can be seen in a smile or soft voice. Because Jeanne Weber, the ogress of Paris, proved that the same hands that cradle a child can also steal its breath. And in her calmness, in her tenderness, lies the most chilling kind of evil, the kind that believes it's doing good. If you found this video disturbing yet fascinating, you're not alone. Evil fascinates us, not because we admire it, but because we fear what it reflects. Subscribe for more dark history documentaries. And remember, the most terrifying monsters are the ones we never see coming.